Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. On the show tonight.
Pardon my French, the Republicans were screwed on the map.
Illinois legislative leaders talk redistricting, ethics, and the first session without former Speaker Michael Madigan.
That's something that clearly fell on way too many deaf ears.
Lawmakers in the Senate passed an elected school board bill, and Chicago's mayor is not happy about it. That and more in Spotlight's Politics.
More rental assistance is available for Chicagoans. We hear more about how to apply.
I think Gary is going to rise, and I hope to be a part of it.
$500 a month for a year, no strings attached. Gary, Indiana launches a guaranteed income pilot program.
And from a New England church to a Chicago museum, behind the journey of a giant Tiffany stained glass window. But first, some of today's top stories. Honoring Chicago's first permanent non-Indigenous settler, John Baptiste Point DuSable, has been a point of contention at City Hall. Today, the mayor elaborated on her plan.
Having something permanent is really, to me, important. But the difference between what we're proposing and just renaming a street is we intend to activate those areas of the river walk with year-round programming to educate both tourists but also our residents about who DuSable was, what his and his wife, what their role is in the history of the city of Chicago.
Now, some older people, we'll explain that later, have called for renaming Outer Lakeshore Drive, but the city council ordinance has been kicked to next month's city council meeting. Last week, Mayor Lori Lightfoot introduced her plan, which would pool public and private dollars to create public art projects, a DuSable Park, and programming along the would-be DuSable Riverwalk and the annual DuSable Festival. Today, the mayor said parts of the plan would require city council approval, but not all. Red Line riders will notice less crowding on trains and shorter commute times in about 3 years. First, riders will notice a lot of construction. Officials broke ground today on the historic Lawrence to Bryn Mawr modernization project, which will rebuild the 100-year-old stations at Lawrence, Argyle, Berwyn, and Bryn Mawr Red Line stations. The upgrades will include adding elevators, wider platforms, and rebuilding track structures for this section of the CTA's busiest line. CTA President Dorval Carter says making the entire system fully accessible is a major goal.
With the completion of this work, we will have 4 more stations that are accessible that were not accessible before. Currently, CTA has 70% of this system accessible, so 70% of our rail system. I've established a goal that we're going to get to 100%.
All of the new stations are expected to be open by the end of 2024. State health officials report 478 people have been diagnosed with COVID-19 since yesterday, and 9 people have died. A total of 1.383 million people in Illinois have been diagnosed since the start of the pandemic, and 22,842 people have died. The state's test positivity rate remains under 2% today at 1.8%. And now to Amanda Vinicky with some legislative leaders on the session in Springfield. Amanda.
Brandis, after several late nights and an extra day on the legislative calendar, state lawmakers wrapped up their spring session. The final days were fiery at times, even without longtime House Speaker and GOP foe Michael Madigan. Joining us to discuss what the General Assembly did and didn't get done are House Republican leader Jim Durkin and Senate Republican leader Dan McConkey. We did also invite House Speaker Chris Welch and Senate President Don Harmon, who were unable to join us. We will hear from Governor J.B. Pritzker on tomorrow evening's show. So let's get things started with you, Leader McConkey. Republicans have slammed the new legislative maps. In 2 sentences, tell me why.
Well, it's based on faulty data, and it was pushed through in a partisan basis in which Republicans were not even invited to participate, and we couldn't have participated right now because the data that's being used is survey data. It's not even the real census data, which will not be available until mid-August.
House Speaker Welch says that these new maps that are passed for Illinois House and Senate districts ensure that all Illinoisans will be represented. Now, here's some of his speech from the House floor.
Take a look around this chamber. Take a look. Take a good look. Look at the diversity in this chamber. Take a look. We represent the state of Illinois. Diversity is the strength of this great state.
The speaker there making the point that diversity is really on the Democratic side of the aisle. Leader Durkin, can you respond to that?
Well, I think that those words are strong and they make the headlines, but it's unfortunate that the speaker and 30 of his members have lied to Illinoisans of their position on fair maps. They've campaigned on it. They have all voted for it. They had the opportunity to do it this year, but they turned their back on all the citizens of Illinois and believe that they should be in control of drawing legislative maps to their advantage. And that is what has happened. Each one of the Democrats, top to bottom, have reversed their position on whether or not the legislature should draw maps as opposed to an independent commission, something that I have been promoting and I have pushed for a number of years. This is about power and control. And what I saw the other night was nothing more than what I've seen in the past with Mike Madigan. So the playbook is still there. And now it's up to the governor to live up to his promise to Illinois citizens to veto a map that is drawn by elected officials, politicians, legislators, which is what happened. So I want the governor to be straight up with Illinois citizens and live up to the commitments that he made as a candidate.
We'll continue to ask questions of him about that. Now, each of you, of course, complaining about these maps, but are you planning to take legal action to stop them from taking effect? Leader McConkey?
Well, certainly all options are on the table, but right now, the leader is right. What we should be doing is encouraging the governor to follow through, make sure that Governor Pritzker is reminiscent of candidate Pritzker. He was on the campaign trail and he promised time and time again to support an independent map drawing process and to veto maps that were drawn by politicians picking their own constituents. This is his golden opportunity right now to prove that he wasn't lying to the people of Illinois.
Now, Leader Durkin, you've already brought him up, and that is, of course, former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. First session without him. What was this first post-Madigan session like?
I expected a lot more. There was a lot of, harmonious words said in January. I also agreed that this is a time for us to go from the past and work together on important issues of the day. That's like our budget, pensions, public safety. And I was disappointed. I expected more from Speaker Welch, and nothing has changed from my perspective. And I will say that the way the maps were drawn and the ratio of probably 5-to-1 Democrat bills called over Republican bills is even more partisan right now under Speaker Welch than it has been under Speaker Madigan.
More partisan. Those are some pretty strong words, but let's move on to the budget. The governor does say that he is going to sign into law the spending plan that Democrats did approve over GOP opposition. He did have more to say about it. Let's give a listen.
Republicans like to badmouth the state, and yet they're the ones who wanted to irresponsibly spend one-time American Rescue Plan dollars to paper over our structural deficit. In contrast, we Democrats are investing in priorities that will grow and revitalize our economy, improving our fiscal outlook dramatically, and reducing tax expenditures on the wealthiest corporations.
Leader McConkey, I'd like you to respond to that. Is this new soon-to-be budget fiscally responsible?
No, of course it isn't. One of the biggest things that we have right now is we have significantly more revenue than we were expecting, over $15 billion, if you count the unexpected revenue at the state level, as well as the extra money that's come in from the federal government. And the issue at the end of the day is how do we make sure we get through the COVID pandemic? A lot of the economic impact that was associated with that is due to Governor Pritzker. It is due to the mitigations that he put in place, the lockdowns, where he was discriminatory, really, in the way in which he did those. He would let Walmart be open, but a small business was forced to close, lay off people. And now we have a $5 billion plus deficit in our unemployment insurance trust fund. This is what pays those bills, really, for people who have been laid off from work. And this budget only puts a very, very small amount into that fund to help make that right. So what we're going to be faced with is very significantly increased taxes, perhaps the biggest tax increases on businesses in Illinois history, coming down the road over the next 3 years, which is going to hurt us being able to really try to climb out of the hole that the governor helped put us into along with the pandemic.
You know, Leader McConkey, I don't want to get too far into this, but you did mention the mitigations, of course, more stringent, that plan change from the Pritzker administration as the pandemic wore on. Have his actions recently in terms of mitigations in the Restore Plan been appropriate?
The biggest problem that I have at the end of the day is he is still doing a go-it-alone approach. Here we are over a year and a quarter into the pandemic, and he decides all sorts of issues on his own without allowing the General Assembly to have any sort of input on how it is that he's doing that. Okay. You know, I understand giving the governor abilities and authorities for emergencies on a short-term basis when we have tornadoes, or fires, or things of that nature. But this is a year-long plus that he's continued to have huge aspects of state government and, frankly, everyday people's lives with just him and his pen. And that's really problematic from my perspective.
Yet the General Assembly didn't really take any action to take that power back during this session when there was the opportunity to do so. Let's move on now. Leader Durkin, you have voted against a CPS elected school board measure. Republicans in the Senate did as well. But how does that square with your and Republicans' commitment to local control, something we heard a lot about during the Rauner era?
Well, I think that you have to throw the Chicago Teachers Union into the factor. They have done nothing except disrupt the management of City Hall the minute after Mayor Lightfoot was elected into office. I don't believe that CTU should take over the Chicago School Board. It is a dangerous, dangerous situation. They are unique from any other school board and any other union in the school board union in the state of Illinois. I do believe in local control, but I'm not going to give it over to a group of activists who have nothing but their only desire is to win the mayor's office, and that is their sole function. And I just can't give them, and nor do I have the faith that they would be right for the city of Chicago taxpayers and also the kids. But I'd like to mention one other thing based on the budget. If the governor believes it's fiscally responsible, then he has to explain why we're giving the legislature a pay raise, why we're doubling the district office allotment that's not necessary, and also explain why he's using $1 billion for Democrat pork projects, which is nothing more than a slush fund, and that came out of the Federal Recovery Act. The governor needs to explain that, and I hope you can ask him those questions tomorrow.
Now, Leader McConkey, the primary was moved to June in recent days. How does that timeline change things, particularly as your party is going to be having to kneel down a nominee for governor?
Well, it's certainly a challenge, but the real question to me is, why is it that they did that? And it's obvious. They were unwilling to draw congressional maps using ACS, American Community Survey data, because there's very stringent rules at the federal level. Every congressional district has to be exactly the same size. But the thing is that they then went ahead and drew a highly partisan map for the state legislature in order to meet the June 30 deadline that they had to be able to exert their control. That's what this is about. This is about maximizing control of the state, and their then willingness to put off the primary and unwillingness to draw a map using ACS data shows just how bad ACS data is for this purpose. The census themselves have said that this data is not to be used for this purpose.
Something and yet else the Democrats that will be keeping
ahead anyway.
Now, Leader Durkin, another measure, part of the budget, so expected to sign into law, will allow the state to have some sort of vaccine lottery. We don't know a lot of details, but from what you are aware, is this a good use of state dollars?
Well, there's a lot of holes in this budget, and it's much like you, I'm not aware of it. We were shut out of negotiations a week before, but vaccination lotteries just doesn't smell right. It doesn't seem right. I think we should stay on the path of encouraging people to get vaccinated as soon as they can, continue with public service announcements. But this is a budget that was presented to us at 11, an amended budget was presented to us at 11:30 in the morning the other night. So quite frankly, I can't answer that question.
11:30, just before midnight, I think you mean.
Right.
Yeah, but I understand. It's been a couple of long days. It all runs together. We thank very much each of you for spending some of your time here with us after all of that, those long hours. So once again, Republican leader Jim Durkin of the House and Senate Republican leader Dan McConkey, we appreciate it.
Thanks, Amanda.
And once again, Governor J.B. Pritzker will join us on tomorrow's program. Now, Paris, we go back to you.
Thanks, Amanda. The city is providing another round of rent and utility assistance to Chicago landlords and renters. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program provides grants of up to 12 months unpaid rent and 3 months of future rent payments. Tenants who apply must have earned less than the maximum household income listed here during 2020 or at the time of application. By August, the eviction ban is set to be lifted in Illinois. So will this assistance be able to keep people afloat as possible evictions come back online? Joining us to help answer that and more are Carol Oshana, a real estate lawyer who works with landlords, and Michelle Gilbert, Legal and Policy Director with Lawyers Committee for Better Housing. Welcome both of you to Chicago tonight. First of you, Michelle, how impactful can this latest round of rental assistance be for Chicagoans?
Well, I really think that this rental assistance is the key, not only in preventing evictions, but preventing the effects that these evictions will have, or the effect that the debt will have long-term, not just on the landlords and tenants, but on the economy generally. And it is a very good chunk of money. It's all federal money. The city and the state are administering rental assistance funds right now that Chicago residents are eligible for. And I think that it really will make a difference.
And as you see there on our graphic, the deadline to apply for this program is June 8th. Carol, you've worked on some county assistance. There's been state and county and city assistance coming. You've worked with landlords on getting assistance. What has that experience been like?
It's difficult. You have to have a lot of information that some landlords may not have. So, for example, of course, you have to have written leases, and sometimes they don't have written leases. Sometimes they don't have the tenant's phone number or email, and oftentimes that's the case because one tenant left and another tenant moved in, like it was a roommate or whoever the person was, and the landlord has no idea who this person is, and the person won't call, they won't answer the door, they won't give away their phone number, they won't give away an email, they refuse to sign things. So it hasn't really been seamless, to be honest. And it's for people that don't speak English very well, it's also a little difficult.
So there can be a lot of snags in applying and getting this assistance. Michelle, this current round of assistance, go ahead. You could, if you want to jump in there.
I'm really glad to, the county has, because the county opened its program first, and it has an ongoing dashboard. And it is actually, it reports that as of today, it's committed $24 million in rental assistance. So, I mean, that's a pretty great accomplishment, and that's just for suburban clubs.
All right, Michelle, in this latest round from Chicago, there are no upper limits on the grant. Why is that important?
Well, in the past rounds of rental assistance, to expedite getting the money out, the funders provided a flat amount. So in the fall, IDA did $5,000, which was really good. You know, landlords and tenants needed that money, but it doesn't quite satisfy the need. So I was very happy that both the Illinois Housing Development Authority and the Chicago Department of Housing listened to comments from advocates, landlords and tenants, and are making, here with this 2021 money, are making specific grants in the amounts that the landlords and tenants need to satisfy the obligation. So this should pay off the rent that is due. And as you indicated at the beginning, also will pay 3 months going forward to really bring housing stability to the market.
All right, so Carol, as we mentioned at the top, I mean, it's been a tough year plus for renters, but that also means a tough year and change for landlords that depend on rental income to pay their mortgages or other bills that they have. Could you just tell us the scope of the situation right now for homeowners, landlords, building owners?
Well, in my experience, the people that are suffering the most are the ones that are living in lower economic areas of Chicago. At least that's been my experience. Most of my phone calls are from areas on the south and west side where rents are pretty inexpensive but relatively speaking, of course. But the people that are either unemployed or they are working, but they don't want to pay because they don't really care because they're.
So have you run into a lot of landlords saying that they believe people can pay, but they're not?
Oh yeah, lots. I have one lady who bought a Mercedes recently. She hasn't paid rent since April.
All right. Well, Michelle, you want to jump in? That's not to minimize the very real pain that we'd assume most renters are going through right now.
Right. I mean, I have no doubt that somebody can find one example of somebody who has abused this process. I mean, there were U.S. senators who traded on inside information. Anything is possible. But I'm part of the Cook County Legal Aid for Housing and Debt, and we're in eviction court every day talking to our office, talking to tenants who don't otherwise have representation. We've defended a number of these. So landlords who believe that their tenants have not properly filed a declaration can file a motion to challenge that. And I'm really happy to report that we have had very good success in defending those motions. Usually the facts are heartbreaking about people who have lost their jobs, tenants who paid their rent consistently, and then this has happened. People have had to quit their jobs because their children were being educated remotely, or people who lost their jobs and made attempts to pay with the stimulus payments, and then just have reached this situation where they have no other resources.
Right. So, Carol, with this latest round of assistance from the city, obviously, it's not just in the renters' interest if they're struggling to get these funds, but also the landlord interest. Do you anticipate helping them help renters apply for this?
Oh yeah, landlords will do it. They'll run. They definitely want it. I haven't, but of course the ones calling me are calling me saying the tenants are not helping. And the problem with the assistance program is that a tenant can apply, and even if the landlord does not respond, they're still eligible. But the reverse is not true. If a landlord applies and the tenant does not participate, the landlord is not eligible.
So potential snag there to work out. Carol, once this eviction moratorium is lifted, we expect in August, what do you anticipate, even with these rounds of assistance? Could there be a lot of activity in eviction court?
Yeah, there will. I think a lot of it is going to be people moving out of the apartment and going to another one because, again, if you're calling me, you probably have a tenant that can pay. Usually people are not calling me to complain about somebody who's broke because they know they have nowhere to go.
And I'm sorry, Carol, we just have a couple seconds. I wanted to get Michelle in on that, too. What are you worried about what happens in August?
I think that there will be dislocation, but I don't think that we're going to see the natural disaster that we have feared all along.
All right.
I think that the rental assistance is going to make the difference.
All right, we're gonna keep following this, and our thanks to both of you for being here and explaining this for us. Carol Oshana, Michelle Gilbert, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And up next, Gary, Indiana launches a guaranteed income pilot program for more than 100 residents, so please stick around for the details.
It really is about community where we all come together.
Chicago needs to make space for everyone.
It's an idea that's grown increasingly popular in recent years, guaranteed or universal basic income payments. Now a pilot program is launching in Gary, Indiana, where more than 100 residents have started to receive monthly payments of $500. Chicago Tonight's Quinn Myers has more on how it works and how local officials hope it could be a model for the entire country.
Augustine Lewis has lived in Gary, Indiana since 1976, when he moved here to work in the steel mills.
I had met some people from Gary that were in the Air Force with me, and they told me about the steel mills and how you could really accumulate money in a fast way legally. And they were right. The steel mill paid well. You could pay your bills and have something left over.
Lewis worked at U.S. Steel until the early 2000s when he was laid off. He's now retired and living on a fixed income. just enough to meet expenses and occasionally support his son Austin, who has autism and lives near Indianapolis.
My bills come out exactly to what my checks from the Social Security and Veterans Pay is, and I'm able to buy one McDonald's and nothing extra.
But starting in May, Lewis received his first of 12 monthly payments of $500 as part of a no-strings-attached guaranteed income pilot program being launched in Gary.
My spending habits will change. I'll be able to spend a little bit more, either on groceries or gasoline to go to see Austin when this pandemic eases up.
Lewis is one of 125 Gary residents getting the money, chosen by lottery out of around 4,000 applicants who had to show they made less than $35,000 a year, among other criteria. For Gary Mayor Jerome Prince, the public-private pilot is about expanding the safety net for residents straining to make ends meet.
We have folks who are existing from payday to payday, and oftentimes they don't have the necessary resources to meet unexpected expenses. And I think that's when things sort of have the potential to cause even larger impediments, or in some instances, very catastrophic situations.
The program is being paid for with $500,000 in seed money from the group Mayors for a Guaranteed Income, with the rest coming from private funding. Prince stresses the monthly payments are about compassion, not a government handout.
If you were given an additional $6,000 a year is what this amounts to, would you stop working, right? And I think the answer would be a resounding no. You know, this is about providing people an opportunity to better themselves and giving them the impetus to do so.
Officials running the pilot program say success could mean a lot of things, like letting people fix up their cars so they can drive to work, or taking their kids on a vacation out of state to visit family for the first time ever. Burgess Peoples is the director of Give Gary, or Guaranteed Income Validation Effort, the group facilitating the pilot's logistics and partnerships with the city and other stakeholders. Peoples is also working with a control group, an additional 150 Gary residents who are not receiving payments, but filling out surveys about their economic needs and challenges.
What is it that you need in your communities? What is it that you need in your city? What do you think our federal government should be doing for individuals across our nation?
Over the past few years, universal income has become a mainstream idea, thanks in part to politicians like Andrew Yang, who have championed the cause, as well as federal stimulus payments during the pandemic. People says one-off checks are great, but regular support is what's needed to actually make a difference.
You have someone that's already in the hole. You give them $600 or $1,200. They have to rapidly pay bills or rent to keep their homes. So they're right back in the same rut they were in. So if you give them dollars consistently, they can consistently pull themselves out of the situation and then start building and starting over again.
For Augustine Lewis, starting over again means going back to school to study social work. He's hoping to use part of his monthly payments to become a counselor for addicts and their families.
I think Gary is going to rise, and I hope to be a part of it once I get into the social work. I expect to one day have a counseling office of my own where people would come to me, and I'd also be able to go out into the field.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Quinn Myers.
Meanwhile, in the Chicago City Council, a proposal has been introduced to use federal relief funds for a similar guaranteed income program, but it has yet to advance out of the Rules Committee. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, a state bill for an elected school board advances, and Mayor Lightfoot thinks it will hurt the search for the next school's CEO in Chicago.
That was classic Mike Madigan.
Why state Republican lawmakers are so outraged about the spring legislative session in our Spotlight Politics. And a close-up look at the colorful and historic Tiffany window that's now turning heads at the Art Institute of Chicago. But first, some more of today's top stories. A historic moment today as the city's first openly gay mayor was on hand to break ground on Chicago's first public monument recognizing the early days of the city's HIV epidemic. Mayor Lori Lightfoot paid tribute to the activists of that time.
We stand on their shoulders every single day in our community, because without that activism, without that determination to have better, not just health outcomes, but a recognition of each and every one in our community as human beings who deserve to have the full array of citizenship. Without that activism, I wouldn't be standing here today as the mayor of Chicago, and I know that.
The first phase of the garden was completed in 2019 with the installation of its anchor piece entitled Self-Portrait, a 30-foot sculpture by the iconic late artist and activist Keith Haring. AIDS Garden Chicago sits near the former Belmont Rocks, where the local gay community often gathered between the 1960s and 90s. The 2.5-acre park along Lake Michigan, just south of Belmont Harbor, is expected to open to the public this fall. And as Pride Month kicks off, join us tomorrow night when Paris will be in North Halsted, formerly known as Boys Town, for our weekly In Your Neighborhood series. State health officials report 478 people have been diagnosed with COVID-19 since yesterday, and 9 people have died. A total of 1.383 million people in Illinois have been diagnosed since the start of the pandemic, and 22,842 people have died. More than 41% of the state's population has been fully vaccinated. And getting your COVID shot could also earn you a free shot, or whatever alcoholic beverage you prefer. Governor J.B. Pritzker signed a bill today allowing businesses that serve alcohol to offer a free drink to anyone with a vaccine. Well, not quite anyone. You still have to be 21, of course, and you have to show proof of vaccination. This expires, though, on July 20th. The law also allows bars and restaurants to continue selling cocktails for pickup and delivery. That's legal until 2024. Now, Paris, we go back to you.
Thanks, Brandis. Elected school board advocates are celebrating the recent passing of a state bill by Senate legislators that would transform the Chicago Board of Education into an elected body. And though Mayor Lori Lightfoot called for an elected school board as a candidate back in 2019, she shared a different opinion earlier today.
When we're talking about the most consequential change in governance for the Chicago public schools, it can't be about the politics. It's got to be about the people. And the people who matter most are our children. This is supposed to be about democracy, but what happened in Springfield had nothing to do with democracy. But democracy, mark my word, will prevail.
And WTTW News reporter Matt Masterson joins us now with more. Okay, Matt, so this is a very complicated bill in terms of how many members, when it becomes hybrid, and then when it becomes an all-elected board. So remind us what's in this bill.
So right, like you said, there's a few different parts to this, but essentially it's going to turn this from an appointed board into an elected board by 2027. So the first round of that could begin as soon as 2024, when the board would move to elections for half of a 21-member board. It would be a hybrid model between appointed members and elected members. And then 2 years later, during the 2026 elections, that's when the board, which would still be 21 members at that point, would become fully elected. So by the 2026 elections, the city is supposed to have been split up into 20 different districts across the city. Each one of those districts is going to be allowed to elect its own member to the board, and then a 21st member will run at large to be the board president. Chicago, of course, for now remains the only board with complete mayoral appointments, so this would be a massive shift if it is turned into a law.
And Matt, we mentioned that the mayor campaigned partially on supporting an elected school board, so why is she so opposed to this?
She's begun pushing more for a permanent hybrid model with appointed and elected members, not something that would transition into a fully elected model like this bill would do. Lightfoot has also said that the bill is being rushed and that it ignores the voices of students and parents within Chicago public schools. But today she also spoke about the impact it could have on the city's ongoing search for a new Chicago public school CEO. Janice Jackson is leaving the school district at the end of this month. And Lightfoot said this bill, if it does turn into a law, could potentially have a negative impact on that search if a potential candidate feels that an elected school board could hamper their ability to make decisions within the district.
So a potential future CEO could be coming into a very uncertain situation. All right, Matt, so it passed the Senate. What about the House? What's next?
So it needs to go back to the House. It's unclear exactly when that's going to happen, but sometime in the next few weeks is possible. And if it receives approval there, then it will go to the desk of Governor Pritzker for final approval to turn into a law.
All right, Matt, we're going to keep following it, and thank you very much. And you can read Matt's full story on our website. That's WTTW.com/news. And up next, our Spotlight Politics team dissects the spring legislative session and much more. So please stay with us.
Don't ever miss Chicago Tonight. Subscribe to our podcast. Get a daily download of our show delivered to your desktop or mobile device. Go to WTTW.com/Chicago Tonight podcast and subscribe.
Another spring legislative session chock full of last-minute bills dropping on lawmakers' desks. Our Spotlight Politics team breaks down what passed and much, much more. Welcome back, Amanda Venicky, Heather Sharon, and Paris Schutz. So, Illinois legislators, as Amanda knows very well, went down to the wire with some of the biggest issues of this spring legislative session. Amanda, let's start with the budget. So, this 1,000-page bill dropped at 11:30 with a midnight deadline, as you mentioned earlier, with some of those lawmakers. New leadership, same old leadership style?
3,000 pages. So I spoke with somebody who said that, actually a Republican who said that their analyst had a difficult time opening it on their computer and therefore even being able to analyze it in time before the votes because it was so big the computer wouldn't even open it. So part of this is just the style of how Springfield operates. There's a lot of wheeling and dealing, and that gets put off into the last minute. We're journalists, fairly deadline-driven people ourselves. But of course, this is something that makes it difficult because I don't yet know. I can't report exactly what is in it. People want to know, is this a balanced budget? All of these numbers are somewhat fungible. You know, it's hard to pinpoint that, but it is particularly difficult to do so at midnight when you haven't even had an opportunity to give it a glance, let alone a read.
Now, the elected school board bill, now that passed the Senate late last night, well past that May 31st deadline. Take a look at what Mayor Lightfoot had to say about its impact on her hiring a new CEO, as she also just discussed.
Because it's not real yet. We'll see what the actual final bill looks like. It could have an impact. It could have a negative impact if a CEO doesn't believe that he or she is actually going to have the ability to make a meaningful difference in the quality of education and the lives of our children.
So, Heather, what is in this bill and why did the mayor lose on this one?
Well, it's a 21-member board, which, as we heard from our colleague Matt, would eventually create a fully elected board, which would end mayoral control, which began in 1995. And I think that Lightfoot lost this one. And although we heard her say it's not a done deal yet, it's got to go back to the House, and then Governor Pritzker has to sign it. But it's worth reminding everybody that Lori Lightfoot campaigned vociferously in favor of a fully elected school board. So I think that she's had trouble communicating about why that changed, why she favored a fully elected board, but now she says that the city needs a hybrid. And part of what she said in recent weeks, it's because the city subsidizes the Chicago public schools to the tune of about $500 million a year for pensions. So that is sure to be an issue, and I expect we will hear more about that in the coming weeks as the House gears up to come back to vote on the measure that passed the Senate.
And Heather, now that we're past this May 31st deadline, what will it take to pass?
That's a 2/3 majority in the House, which in a normal legislator might be a tall order, but the Democrats have a supermajority, and as Amanda has reported all along, the Democrats have marched in lockstep under Speaker Welch's authority, and I would expect that all of them will vote in favor of an elected school board. They have voted several times in favor of an elected school board over the last several years, so Mayor Lightfoot has an uphill battle to convince them that what they voted for several times in the past several years isn't the right way to go.
And truthfully, the mayor hasn't had a lot of success in Springfield, period. So this just adds to that list. It's not as if she has had the victories that her predecessors did and really a close relationship with, in particular, the legislators from Chicago. The contingent, the delegation from Chicago is out of sync with the mayor on this one.
So an ethics reform also passed, but critics say it doesn't go far enough, which is surprising since we know that former Speaker Mike Madigan's chief of staff, Tim Mapes, was indicted during the session. Paris?
Well, it's not that surprising when you consider the fact that it's hard to get lawmakers to pass legislation that perhaps goes against their personal interests or their financial interests. I mean, there were some things accomplished here. The Legislative Inspector General now has the authority to open investigation of possible corruption among the General Assembly, but they can't make those results public unless they get the approval of a commission of current and former lawmakers. And this is how these IG laws get stripped of their teeth all over the state. You know, the big problem that reform groups have with the action or lack of action on ethics is that not much was done to solve this revolving door of lawmakers then going into lucrative careers in lobbying, or lawmakers that lobby other units of government while they're a lawmaker. I mean, read Luis Arroyo, the former lawmaker. So, I mean, this is kind of one of those only in Illinois things. So what reform groups wanted was sort of a cooling off period, like you can't become a lobbyist. Or a ban outright. But they would have settled for something like, okay, 1 year or 2 years after you retire as a lawmaker, you can't become a lobbyist. Well, here, if you retire in the middle of your term, you have to wait up to 6 months. But if you finish out your term, you end your career, you could become theoretically a lobbyist the next day. So the reform groups say that doesn't really solve the problem of the revolving door, which is at the heart of what's going on with this federal investigation into ComEd.
And speaking of ComEd, this embattled utility is asking for a rate hike in the middle of a bribery scandal where 4 people have been indicted, including its former CEO. Amanda, is this affecting the bill at all?
Yeah, so it's actually ComEd's parent company, Exelon, but
Yes.
while those companies will try very hard to separate them, I think in a lot of people's eyes, they sure aren't. And that includes in the General Assembly, or at least in the public, because, yes, how can that not cast a shadow over all of these things? Particularly, it's not just that, it's that the very law that is cited in those documents where ComEd admitted to having this long-running bribery scheme, really not even a year ago, was to support nuclear plants. And that is part of this massive energy bill and negotiations going on now. And I think it's further complicated because it is a flat out, you will see, and can see on your electric bill how big that subsidy is that is going to Exelon, a very profitable company. These nuclear plants may not be, but the company most certainly is. So there's the corruption and just the sheer, nobody, especially right now, has or wants to give more money out of their pockets to a utility.
Now, Paris lawmakers also moved the primary in 2022 from March to June. Why did they do that?
Well, as you heard the Republican leader of the Senate, McConkey, say earlier, the general consensus here is because they really need to wait for that late arriving census data to come in before they draw the new congressional district maps, because it has to be that they have to have equal amount of population in each map. They didn't have those restrictions so much with the state and judicial maps that they redrew, but moving this primary back, and this is just a one-time deal where they're going to move it to June from March, gives folks time to wait for these new maps to be drawn before they have to start getting stuff ready to run for office, filing all the paperwork. So it was an accommodation for that, and it's hard to imagine Illinois is going to be very influential in the next primary election if the primary is that far into the summer. You've heard folks talking in the past that Illinois should become one of the first primary states so that it plays a bigger role in the primary, because Illinois is the most representative state population-wise of the entire country. So this is kind of the opposite of that.
Now, Heather, here's something that you wrote about just yesterday. The new term for alderman is now alderperson. Go on.
That's right. So alderman is not a gender-neutral term, and a full 30% of the Chicago City Council is female, and it has been, wait for it, 50 years since the first women were elected to the city council. So this big elections omnibus bill would change the formal title from alderman to alderperson or alderpeople. And there are some aldermen who are very excited about this. And one of them, Alderman Andre Vasquez of the 40th Ward, had actually introduced a non-binding resolution several months ago to change the formal title to alder. That didn't really fly with his colleagues, so this seemed like the next best thing, but it caught many aldermen that I spoke with this week off guard that it ended up in this bill. the mysterious ways of Springfield. You got to keep a close eye on it every single second.
Surprise! So both the city and the state are on track for full reopenings as COVID-19 infections remain low. Amanda, the CDC has recommended that people don't get tested if they think they have the coronavirus. This refers specifically to those who have been vaccinated. But could the infection rate actually be higher?
You know, I am no epidemiologist, but yeah, who knew? But I mean, so theoretically, yes, but clearly the CDC is making this because of this sort of recommendation, because that is not really the suspicion. More and more people getting vaccinated. We've known that was going to bring things down. So this is the PSA journalists. We like to, of course, remain as objective as possible. But in this case, it's all over. Get that vaccine.
Okay, so earlier we talked about the bill offering a shot in a beer was signed today by the governor, and the governor wants to give out lottery tickets as incentives for folks to get vaccinated. Heather, any evidence that these kind of tactics might work?
Yes. So Ohio was the first state to institute a vaccination lottery, and they saw a 45% increase in the number of people who got vaccinated after the governor announced that maybe they could win $1 million, or if they were in high school, a full ride to a state university. So it's clear that there are some people who are waiting to make it worth their while. And starting on June 10th, if your favorite watering hole is participating in this between the hours of 6 p.m. and 10 p.m. and you are of legal drinking age, you can bring your vaccination card and demand the boozy drink of your heart and celebrate at least the end of the pandemic for you, hopefully personally.
Sounds like some people will be making plans then. So relative good news for the start of the summer. The number of murders over the Memorial Day weekend was 3. Relative good news. Take a look at what Superintendent David Brown said about the work of violence interrupters.
Some of our neighborhoods that are increasingly more violent than others, they're there till 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning with our Chicago police officers intervening in ways that Chicago police officers can't.
Now, Heather, we know violence interrupters and community partners have been active in years past. What is it that made the difference this past weekend for that decrease in murders?
Well, I think we have to wait and see. The summer is very young. It was not hot. It was, in fact, cold this weekend, and experts will tell you that summer violence tracks sometimes with the temperatures. This weekend is supposed to be very, very hot. So I know that Superintendent David Brown and Mayor Lightfoot are also sort of focusing on those efforts. But the mayor's strategy to address this violence has put more money towards sending people who have been a part of the gang life, who have criminal histories, to go back into the neighborhoods and to talk to the people who are either involved in these sort of confrontations and to try to mediate a solution. The mayor sees that as a potentially more effective way of reducing violence than just simply arresting and throwing people in jail. It's very unclear whether that will make a real difference this summer after we've seen just a really steady increase in both shootings and murders truly since the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020.
And of course, the bad news is that shootings, though, are still up for that same period of 2020. Amanda, the legislature passed a new gun bill, but narrowly this session. What kind of impact are they hoping that'll have?
So actually, I'm sorry, the House passed a bill, the Senate passed a bill, they didn't pass the same bill. And so we are not really left with major changes when it comes to gun licensing. This is, we even see that demand for guns soar. We hear even from Chicago legislators, they say they want to protect themselves. So they're hearing from people who want to protect themselves and are frustrated that they can't get that FOID card that need to legally carry a gun. And then you have critics who are saying, hey, wait a second, the people who are the ones that are perpetrators of these shootings that we see and much of the violence in Chicago are not paying much attention to the state's system to apply for a gun license, and they're not particularly worried about that. So this is most certainly, to me, something that is interesting, given that guns are not a partisan issue. It is generally more of a regional one in Illinois, and yet we've talked a lot about these supermajorities that Democrats have, and still, after years after the Aurora mass shooting that really sort of brought a closer look and attention to flaws in the state's gun licensing system, nothing has changed.
Paris, could this help potentially with Chicago's pervasive gun problem, or is that more caused by illegal guns?
Yeah, I hate to be pessimistic. I mean, maybe it could cause a small dent. As I understand, in one of these bills, there's a provision that would require background checks for private sales. But having covered this in the past and talked to county and federal prosecutors, there's really no way to track the paper trail of gun transfers. And there is no paper trail is the thing, and so there's no way to really prosecute that. And the guns that wind up in the streets in Chicago, the majority of them were not purchased here. I mean, there were many purchased in Cook County or downstate, but purchased in Indiana or purchased in Wisconsin, where there are much more lax rules in terms of purchasing and background checks. So as long as those border states still have the policies they have, it's reasonable to assume that it's still going to be pretty easy for these guns to get in the hands of people that then misuse them.
And quickly before we go, Heather, Barack Obama is in Chicago this week, of course, to tout the presidential center. Are you surprised that he hasn't been here more to drum up support for it when there's been some opposition?
There has been, and I think we are really seeing the fact that this is now a done deal. They have all of the approvals in place. The legal issues, by and large, have been resolved. And several months ago, the city started working on sort of the underground utility work and sort of the road work that needs to happen before an official groundbreaking can take place, which is expected later this summer or early this fall. So we're starting to see that PR push take shape. And, you know, it has always hurt the Chicagoan in my heart that Barack Obama has not been back home as much as we had thought that he would be after his presidential term.
Well, his portrait is coming soon, so there's that. In the meantime, my thanks to Amanda Vinicky, Heather Sharon, and Paris Schutz. Up next, a luminous glass addition to the Art Institute. But first, a look at the weather.
It is a heavenly depiction of a beautiful place on earth. It's also a fine work of art and one of the newest acquisitions at the Art Institute of Chicago. Producer Mark Vitale visited to explore an illuminating landscape made from light and glass.
Just one radiant work transforms the grand staircase at the Art Institute. Of course, it is 26 feet high and contains 48 separate sections of stained glass. It was made by Tiffany Studios and completed in 1917.
Tiffany Studios was the foremost studios for stained glass and really helped revolutionize the medium here in the United States. They were creating new types of glass, new combinations, where the natural effects of the landscapes and the scenes that they were depicting is coming through the material. This isn't a work where the surfaces are painted. This is really nature realized through the medium. So in its scale, in its size, in the intricate combination of these glass types, there's nothing like it.
Acquired from a church in Providence, Rhode Island, this masterpiece in glass depicts a New England landscape, not a scene from the Bible like you might expect.
This was a new direction that Tiffany Studios was forging. You know, Louis Comfort Tiffany had a vision and was interested in landscape. This certainly wasn't something that was common in religious settings at the time, but you start to see them exploring this connection between nature and spirituality. Here, that is connected quite literally through the psalm verse that appears across the bottom of the window. But it's also something that sitting in that space, you would have looked up into this kind of natural world and been moved in that way.
In the church, the window was positioned high above the altar. In its new setting, it's more approachable. The work is attributed to Agnes Northrup, who worked in the so-called women's department at Tiffany Studios.
She was the foremost landscape designer for the firm. She was doing these special one-of-a-kind commissions, and we can kind of see her hand in the composition, in the flora and fauna throughout the scene. She would have been the vision behind this, but then you would have had other people that were, you know, chemists who were mixing the glass formulas to create these spectacular combinations that could achieve these natural effects.
The glass arrived in good condition, but it is over 100 years old and needed restoration and careful installation. Other architectural treasures share the space with the monumental work, which is lit from behind by LED lighting. The skylight over the staircase adds highlights throughout the day.
The light changes. It's never the same in any moment that you're looking at it. So the light coming through the mountains, down the waterfall, it's different from perspectives throughout the gallery. It also is different throughout the day. So to me, it's a singular work in this space, and yet it looks like it's been here all along.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
Neither the church, which remains open, nor the Art Institute will say how much that window cost. And the church wanted stewards who could restore it to its former glory and place it where it could be seen by more people. And the Art Institute wanted a unique piece of American art. So there you go. It's called the Hartwell Memorial Window, and it's now permanently on view. And that is our show for this Wednesday night.
Please join us tomorrow night live at 7. One-on-one with Governor J.B. Pritzker and his assessment of the spring legislative session.
And a new skateboard program created during the pandemic gives Chicago youth the chance to shred at local boys and girls clubs. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. Thanks for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning for this program is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives.